The neighborhood looked perfect on the surface. Every lawn was neatly mowed, every fence painted fresh, and the houses lined up like a row of postcards. From the outside, it seemed calm and quiet, the kind of place where people waved when they passed and neighbors borrowed sugar without thinking twice. But beneath that calm surface, there was a current of tension most outsiders would never notice. For years, the Homeowners Association, or HOA, had quietly ruled the neighborhood with strict rules and an almost obsessive eye for detail. They had long lists of regulations about lawn height, mailbox styles, paint colors, even how far a trash can could be from the curb. Many people thought the rules were just annoying but harmless. For some residents, however, the HOA's behavior had crossed into something more personal, especially when it came to new neighbors who didn't fit in with their idea of the perfect street. Among these new arrivals was a black man who had recently moved into one of the nicest homes on the block. He had chosen the house for its quiet setting, the view of the small lake behind it, and the space to work in his garage. He was polite to everyone, kept his property clean, and minded his own business. He spent evenings working in his garden, walking his dog, or quietly reading on the porch. Despite his friendly demeanor, a few on the HOA board seemed determined to make him feel unwelcome. At first, the complaints were small. They said his mailbox was too flashy, his grass was a little too tall after a weekend, his driveway had a tiny crack. Every minor issue was documented and sent to him in formal letters. He corrected each problem, often before the deadlines, but the complaints kept coming. It was clear that the issue wasn't the mailbox or the driveway. The issue was him. The HOA president, a woman who had lived on the street for decades, believed she had a responsibility to protect the neighborhood standards. She often spoke about keeping property values high and maintaining order, but her actions sometimes suggested she cared more about control than fairness. Her inner circle, a few other longtime residents, supported her quietly, sharing her belief that newcomers, especially those who didn't match their image of the neighborhood, needed to be taught a lesson. One afternoon, as the black neighbor tended to his garden, he noticed the president talking with another board member across the street. They were pointing in his direction, whispering and smiling in a way that seemed too intentional. It made him uneasy, but he shook it off. He had learned over the years not to jump to conclusions. Still, he made a mental note to be cautious. Over the next few weeks, the subtle tension escalated. One morning, he found a note stuck to his door, claiming that multiple neighbors had called the authorities about suspicious activity at his house. The note was unsigned, and it referred to vague investigations that made no sense. He read it twice, puzzled, but the handwriting seemed familiar. It matched the style of the HOA president's earlier letters. Then came the message that would change everything. He received a formal-looking letter claiming that law enforcement would be visiting his home that week to inspect for compliance. The letter used official-sounding language and logos that seemed real at first glance. It didn't say which department would come, only that action would be taken. It was intimidating, but he wasn't easily scared. The black neighbor had a background that very few people knew about. Before moving to this quiet lakefront house, he had spent years in federal law enforcement. He had worked on cases that involved fraud, corruption, and impersonation of officials. He knew how to read documents critically, and he immediately recognized the signs of forgery. The letter was fake, meant to scare him into submission. But rather than panic, he saw it as an opportunity to observe and gather evidence. He started by paying closer attention to the neighborhood. He noticed people watching his house from across the street, taking note of his movements and sometimes driving by slowly in unfamiliar cars. Nothing was overtly threatening, but the pattern was clear. He wasn't being left alone. Someone was trying to intimidate him. Instead of confronting anyone directly, he quietly prepared. He reviewed his own security measures, ensuring cameras and recording devices were functioning. He reached out to a few friends he trusted, explaining that the neighborhood might be planning a harassment attempt. He didn't want to alarm anyone unnecessarily, but he wanted to be ready. Then came the day he had anticipated. 2 men showed up at his front door in uniforms that looked official. They carried badges and identification, claiming to be law enforcement responding to complaints. They spoke in a serious tone, demanding to see his identification and to inspect the house. Their presence was intimidating, but he kept his composure. He greeted them politely and asked for their names, badge numbers, and the department they represented. The men hesitated. Their reactions were slightly off, too rehearsed, too mechanical. He noticed details that didn't match standard procedure. The way they held their notepads, the way they spoke to him, the small inconsistencies in their uniform patches. Within seconds, he realized these were not real officers. They were imposters. Remaining calm, he told them that he would cooperate only if they provided official credentials. He didn't raise his voice or confront them aggressively. Instead, he spoke firmly, calmly and clearly, signaling that he was not an easy target. The fake officers looked uneasy, trying to maintain their authority, but it was clear that their act was unraveling. While they were distracted, he quietly activated a line of communication he had reserved for emergencies. In less than a minute, he was in contact with former colleagues who could verify his suspicions and respond if needed. He stayed polite and calm, never letting the imposters know he had called for backup. He kept them talking, asking questions about their supposed assignment, listening carefully to every word. The imposters began to fumble, contradicting themselves in small ways. They mentioned neighbors who had complained, but the names were incorrect. They referred to agencies that didn't exist. Each lie was like a small crack in the facade they had tried to present. The black neighbor took mental notes of everything, knowing that these details could later be used as evidence if necessary. Meanwhile, across the street, the HOA president and her inner circle were unaware that their plan was failing. They had assumed that sending fake officers would scare him, make him feel unwelcome, and perhaps push him to move. They didn't realize that they had chosen the wrong target. They didn't know that the man they were trying to intimidate had spent years dealing with threats, deception, and people who thought they could bully others with false authority. As the imposters continued their act, they grew visibly nervous. They realized he wasn't complying blindly, and that he was observing their every move. The black neighbor stayed calm, his demeanor steady, making it clear that he was in control. He didn't need to yell or make threats. His confidence alone unsettled them. The situation reached a turning point when he asked for their department's contact information, saying he would verify their assignment immediately. The imposters hesitated again, clearly unsure how to respond. Their confidence began to crumble, their voices losing some of the authority they had tried to project. He recognized that he now held the upper hand, not because he had to fight, but because he had remained composed and alert. Inside, he reflected on the irony of the situation. All these months, he had tried to blend in, live quietly, and respect the rules of a neighborhood that sometimes seemed more concerned with appearances than fairness. Now the same people who had complained about a mailbox or lawn were facing someone who understood the law, the consequences of impersonation, and the risks of harassment. He thought about how easy it would be to let anger take over, but he refused to give them that satisfaction. Instead, he focused on gathering evidence, documenting every detail, and ensuring that the truth would come to light. Every word the imposter said, every gesture, every inconsistency was noted. He made sure to remain polite and civil, never giving them a reason to escalate the situation. This was not about revenge. It was about justice and accountability. While all this unfolded at the front door, neighbors peeked from behind curtains, curious but cautious. Some had seen the fake officers and wondered what was happening. Others noticed the tension in the air and sensed that the situation was more serious than it seemed. The black neighbor's calm presence contrasted sharply with the imposter's nervous energy, making it clear to any observer that he was not someone to intimidate easily. By the time the imposters left, it was clear that their plan had failed. The black neighbor had not only remained safe, but he had also collected the information necessary to expose them. They had underestimated him, assuming that appearance and intimidation were enough to control him. They had been wrong. Afterward, he took a moment to reflect. He felt no joy in what had happened, only a quiet sense of satisfaction that he had handled the situation wisely. He knew this was only the beginning of a longer story, one that would reveal the true nature of the HOA's actions and the lengths they were willing to go. But he was ready. He had the knowledge, the training, and the calm demeanor needed to see it through. The quiet lakefront house, once just a place to live, had become a stage where courage, intelligence, and patience would play out. And after the imposters left, the black neighbor felt a mixture of relief and determination. Relief because the situation had ended without anyone getting hurt, and determination because he knew this was far from over. The HOA's actions were deliberate, and they had underestimated him completely. They thought fear could drive him away, but now he knew exactly how he would respond. He needed to make sure the truth came out, and he needed to protect himself while doing it. He started by reviewing the footage from his security cameras. Every angle of the driveway and the front porch had been recorded, and every detail of the imposter's visit was captured clearly. He carefully noted their mannerisms, the license plates of the cars they had arrived in, and even the small mistakes they made while pretending to be law enforcement. Every tiny detail mattered, and he knew that this evidence would be crucial if the situation escalated. At the same time, he reached out to a few trusted contacts from his past career. These were people who understood how impersonation of law enforcement worked, and who could provide guidance if he needed to take legal steps. He explained the situation calmly, outlining what had happened and what he had observed. His contacts were shocked by the audacity of the HOA, but they agreed that he had handled everything perfectly. They also emphasized that he needed to be careful, because people who feel powerful often take reckless actions when confronted. Meanwhile, the HOA board had gathered in a small meeting room at one of the members' houses. They were congratulating themselves on what they thought had been a successful operation. In their minds, they had sent a warning, shown the new neighbor that he was being watched, and kept the neighborhood safe. They didn't yet realize that their plan had failed, and that the man they tried to intimidate was far from ordinary. One of the board members, more cautious than the others, began to voice concern. He suggested that they might have gone too far, and that their actions could have legal consequences. But the president waved him off, saying they had nothing to worry about. "We just scared him a little," she said confidently. "He'll think twice before breaking any rules. He'll learn his place." The others nodded in agreement, too confident in their control to consider the possibility that they could be in serious trouble. Back at the lakefront house, the black neighbor was planning his next steps carefully. He knew that exposing the HOA publicly without proper evidence could backfire, and he also knew that confronting them directly could provoke them further. Instead, he focused on building a clear, undeniable record of everything that had happened. He reviewed the letters, notes, and documents the HOA had sent, matching them with the footage and audio recordings from the day of the fake visit. Every detail reinforced the pattern of harassment. He also spoke quietly with neighbors he trusted, asking if they had noticed anything unusual or if they had witnessed any interactions between the HOA and him. Some had seen things, but most were hesitant to speak out. They were polite, avoiding confrontation, and some had even believed the HOA's letters themselves. He encouraged them to be honest and assured them that their statements would be protected if legal action became necessary. Slowly, he began to see that not everyone in the neighborhood supported the board's tactics, and that gave him hope that the truth could be revealed. One morning, as he was organizing his evidence, he noticed a car slowly driving past his house. It was the same model he had seen the day of the fake visit, but the driver didn't recognize him. The car stopped briefly. The windows rolled down, and he could see the faces of two people inside. They appeared to be taking notes and looking around, just as the fake officers had done. He realized immediately that the HOA was still trying to monitor him, perhaps planning another attempt. He remained calm. Instead of reacting with anger or confrontation, he observed. He noted the license plate, the direction the car went, and even the time it passed. He understood that the board might escalate their actions if they sensed weakness or fear, so he maintained his composure. He also prepared a detailed timeline of every incident so far, including the new sighting, making sure that nothing could be dismissed as coincidence or imagination. As the week went on, tension in the neighborhood quietly grew. Other residents began noticing small, unusual behaviors. The board members seemed more anxious than usual, whispering when neighbors passed by and glancing toward the black neighbor's property. Some residents exchanged worried looks, sensing that something wasn't right. The air, which had seemed calm before, now carried a quiet undercurrent of suspicion and unease. The black neighbor, however, continued his routines as if nothing were wrong. He tended to his garden, walked his dog along the lake, and maintained polite interactions with neighbors. But behind the calm exterior, he was planning the next move. He knew that patience and strategy were his best allies. His goal wasn't revenge, it was accountability. He wanted to make sure the HOA's actions were recognized as harassment, and he wanted to prevent them from targeting anyone else in the future. Late one afternoon, he received a call from a former colleague who had been briefed about the situation. They discussed the possibility of involving federal authorities directly, given that impersonating law enforcement is a federal crime. His colleague suggested a careful approach. First, collect incontrovertible evidence and then allow law enforcement to intervene. The black neighbor agreed, knowing that rushing could allow the HOA to cover up or destroy evidence. That evening, he reviewed the security footage again, making small enhancements and timestamps to ensure nothing could be questioned later. He also documented all previous letters and communications, photographing them and noting dates and delivery methods. Everything was organized meticulously. He knew that when the time came, he would have a complete record of the HOA's harassment. Meanwhile, the HOA board was unaware that their target was not intimidated. They continued to discuss their plan, even considering more aggressive measures. One member suggested sending another person in uniform to reinforce the warning, but the president hesitated. She knew the first attempt hadn't caused the reaction they expected, but she still believed that persistence would eventually work. She didn't realize that each attempt only made the situation riskier for them. The black neighbor also began quietly informing a few neighbors about what had happened, without creating alarm. He explained that the previous visit by fake officers was serious, and that anyone receiving similar letters or visits should document them carefully. Some neighbors were shocked, realizing that the HOA's tactics had gone beyond petty complaints. Others were grateful for the advice, appreciating the calm, factual manner in which he explained the situation. Days passed, and the tension built without any visible confrontation. The black neighbor's quiet composure was a stark contrast to the anxious energy of the HOA board. Every movement, every action of theirs was being observed, analyzed, and documented. He knew that they had underestimated him completely, and that gave him confidence that the truth would eventually come to light. Finally, he decided it was time to escalate in a controlled way. He prepared a detailed report, including photos, video clips, and copies of all letters and documents. He organized it chronologically, showing a clear pattern of harassment. He also drafted a short factual statement explaining the events and identifying the imposters. Everything was ready to be presented to authorities if necessary. He didn't announce his plan to the neighborhood. He didn't confront the HOA publicly yet. Instead, he continued to live his life as normally as possible, maintaining the appearance of calm while ensuring that every piece of evidence was secure. He understood that patience and careful preparation were more powerful than anger or confrontation. The following week, another small incident occurred. A package was left at his door with a note claiming that the authorities were still watching him. Most people might have panicked or removed the package without a second thought, but he examined it carefully. The handwriting matched the style of the HOA president's previous notes. The timing, the wording, the placement, it all confirmed what he already knew. They were desperate to maintain control, and their tactics were becoming more obvious. He documented this incident as well, photographing the package, the note, and even the surrounding area. Every detail was preserved. He also reached out quietly to a legal advisor, explaining the escalation and asking for guidance on how to proceed safely. The advisor confirmed that he had enough evidence to involve law enforcement, but agreed that patience and careful documentation were crucial. By the end of Part 2, the black neighbor had turned the situation on its head. What was meant to intimidate him had instead become a record of harassment and deception. The HOA, confident in their control, had no idea they were being observed and documented at every step. They had underestimated his experience, his calm, and his intelligence. The stage was set for a confrontation that would expose the HOA's actions completely, but it would happen on his terms with patience, precision, and quiet strength. He continued to live his life normally, tending to the garden, walking the dog, and interacting politely with neighbors. But behind the calm exterior, he was prepared. Every letter, every visit, every suspicious action was being logged and saved. The HOA board had no idea that the black neighbor had turned their own tactics against them. They were still convinced that sending fake officers, monitoring him, and sending threatening letters would make him bend to their rules. Each board meeting was filled with quiet boasting, as if their clever plan had already succeeded. They didn't notice that their words were being recorded, their actions logged, and their mistakes carefully documented. Across the street, the black neighbor went about his life with calm precision. He tended to his garden, organized his paperwork, and maintained casual conversations with neighbors. To most, he seemed unaffected, polite, and ordinary. But behind his composed exterior, he was preparing the next step. A step that would expose the HOA's harassment and bring accountability. He began by reviewing the events of the past few weeks and compiling them into a clear, organized timeline. Every letter, every visit, every suspicious vehicle was logged. He had photographs of notes and packages left at his door, video footage of the fake officers and their cars, and detailed observations about the HOA members' behaviors. Each piece of evidence reinforced the pattern of deliberate intimidation. Knowing the importance of timing, he decided to gather more witness statements. He spoke privately with neighbors he trusted, carefully explaining what had happened without causing panic. Some were shocked. They had assumed the HOA's complaints were routine, harmless rules enforcement. Others had quietly witnessed strange behaviors, visits from unfamiliar people, and letters that seemed threatening. With gentle encouragement, they agreed to provide written statements. He also prepared for the possibility that the HOA might escalate further. He installed additional cameras, set up discreet audio recording devices, and made sure his communications were secure. His goal was not confrontation for its own sake, but safety, clarity, and accountability. Every measure he took ensured that the truth would be documented, and that the HOA's attempts to intimidate him would be undone by their own actions. Then, one afternoon, an unexpected opportunity presented itself. A car pulled slowly into the neighborhood, its windows down. The driver waved casually to a board member who had been observing the black neighbor's property from across the street. The black neighbor immediately recognized the situation. These were not ordinary visitors. They were part of the HOA's ongoing surveillance plan. Rather than confront them directly, he watched quietly from inside the house. He noted the license plate, the car model, and the interaction with the board member. Every word and gesture was recorded. The HOA had assumed he would react out of fear or anger, but he remained calm, observing carefully. The calmness itself became a strategy, showing that their intimidation tactics had no power over him. Word of the black neighbor's calm and preparedness began to spread quietly among other residents. Some were impressed by his patience and composure, others curious about what he had done to handle the fake officers earlier. His careful approach was a contrast to the board's nervous energy, and some neighbors began questioning whether the HOA's behavior was really justified. Meanwhile, the HOA president remained confident. She had started drafting new letters, planning follow-up actions, and even considered hiring another person to pose as law enforcement. In her mind, persistence would eventually wear him down. She didn't realize that each new plan was being observed and documented, and that any attempt to escalate could backfire dramatically. The black neighbor decided it was time to involve official authorities in a controlled way. He reached out to a trusted colleague in federal law enforcement, sharing the organized timeline and evidence he had collected. He explained the ongoing surveillance, the fake officers, and the pattern of harassment. The colleague immediately recognized the seriousness of the situation, agreeing that this was no ordinary HOA dispute. They arranged to have federal investigators review the evidence discreetly, ensuring that any action taken would be based on clear proof. With federal involvement on the horizon, the dynamics in the neighborhood began to shift. The black neighbor continued his daily routines, but he remained vigilant. He knew the HOA might attempt further intimidation if they suspected he had taken legal steps. He was prepared, documenting every interaction, recording every unusual visit, and making detailed notes about any suspicious behavior. The board, unaware of federal attention, grew restless. Some members began whispering about the difficulty of handling him, questioning whether their tactics were working. The president insisted they continue with their plan, but doubts were creeping in among her allies. The careful, patient strategy of the black neighbor was slowly destabilizing their confidence. One morning, the black neighbor received another letter, unsigned and threatening. It claimed that authorities were still watching and implied potential consequences for him. Instead of reacting with fear, he calmly photographed the letter, logged it in his timeline, and added it to the growing collection of evidence. He also informed his federal contact, providing copies of the letter and the accompanying details. Each action he took was deliberate, building a complete and undeniable record of harassment. Soon after, the HOA board's plan began to unravel. One of the board members accidentally admitted to sending the fake officers during a casual conversation with another neighbor. This neighbor, who had been quietly observing and recording events, shared the information with the black neighbor. He added it to his timeline, creating yet another piece of evidence that confirmed the HOA's direct involvement in the intimidation attempt. By now, the neighborhood was buzzing quietly with curiosity and concern. More residents began to notice the tension, the suspicious vehicles, and the repeated letters. Some had started asking questions, and a few even began wondering whether the HOA's leadership was truly acting in the neighborhood's best interest. The black neighbor's careful, calm approach had inspired others to pay closer attention and to question authority when necessary. The HOA president remained oblivious to the growing scrutiny. She continued to discuss solutions for dealing with him, unaware that their actions had already been documented and reported. She believed she was still in control, but her confidence was increasingly misplaced. The calm, methodical approach of the black neighbor had given him a clear advantage, and each attempt by the board to intimidate him only added to the growing evidence against them. In one particularly tense moment, a new visitor arrived, claiming to be conducting an inspection on behalf of the HOA. The black neighbor politely asked for official credentials, as he had done before. The visitor hesitated, their nervousness apparent. The black neighbor maintained a calm demeanor, recording the interaction. The visitor left quickly, and he added the encounter to his growing evidence collection. Each failed attempt by the HOA to intimidate him only strengthened his case. Meanwhile, he continued to build relationships with other neighbors, quietly offering guidance and advice. Some residents began sharing their own experiences with HOA harassment, adding their stories to the growing narrative. The black neighbor emphasized patience, documentation, and calm observation, teaching them that intimidation could be countered without confrontation. His actions inspired quiet courage and self-respect throughout the community. As the days passed, the federal investigation quietly intensified. Agents reviewed his detailed timeline, his photographs, video recordings, and documents. They were impressed by the thoroughness and clarity of his records. They confirmed that impersonating law enforcement and orchestrating harassment for personal gain were serious federal offenses. The evidence he had collected was not only compelling but nearly impossible to dispute. Back in the neighborhood, the HOA board's confidence continued to waver. Members whispered among themselves, wondering why their plans never seemed to succeed. Some began to worry about potential legal consequences. The president, still determined, refused to acknowledge the growing risk. But even her closest allies were beginning to doubt her leadership. The black neighbor, aware of the changes in the neighborhood's dynamics, remained focused. He knew that exposing the HOA's actions required patience and precision. He continued to document every interaction, ensuring that each piece of evidence was securely stored and clearly labeled. He also began drafting a concise report summarizing all incidents, to be submitted to authorities when the time was right. One evening, after completing his report for the day, he reflected on the events so far. He realized that what had started as a simple attempt at intimidation had turned into a test of patience, strategy, and composure. He had resisted fear, documented every detail, and maintained his dignity throughout. By staying calm and focused, he had turned the HOA's own tactics against them. He also thought about the neighbors who had begun to question the HOA's authority. Some had quietly expressed admiration for his approach, while others were relieved to see someone standing up against harassment. He understood that the impact of his actions extended beyond his own situation. By confronting the intimidation with intelligence and composure, he had set an example of courage and resilience for the entire community. As Part 3 comes to a close, the stage is set for the next phase. The HOA board remains unaware of the federal scrutiny they are under, and they continue to operate under the law. The HOA board still believed they were in control, but the reality was very different. What had started as subtle intimidation had escalated into a situation far beyond their understanding. Across the street, the black neighbor remained calm as he always had. while quietly preparing for the moment when accountability would finally reach them. He continued to maintain his daily routines, tending to his garden, walking his dog, and speaking politely to neighbors. From the outside, it seemed like nothing had changed. But inside, he was meticulously organizing the evidence he had collected over weeks: letters, notes, photographs, video footage, recordings, and witness statements. Every detail of every incident was cataloged and time-stamped. He knew that presenting a clear, irrefutable record would make all the difference. Meanwhile, tension within the HOA board began to grow. Some members were quietly worried that their actions might have crossed legal lines. The president, however, continued to push forward, insisting that they were only enforcing rules. She believed the black neighbor was still intimidated, unaware that he had documented every attempt to harass him. Every new plan they discussed, every conversation they had, was potentially part of the evidence against them. One afternoon, federal agents arrived in the neighborhood discreetly. They approached the black neighbor's house, introducing themselves calmly and professionally. He invited them inside and presented the full collection of evidence. Letters, photographs, video clips, and documented interactions were laid out in an organized sequence. The agents were immediately impressed. They recognized the seriousness of the harassment and the HOA's attempts to impersonate law enforcement. The agents spent several hours reviewing the timeline, cross-referencing it with official procedures, and confirming the validity of the evidence. They asked questions, clarified details, and noted inconsistencies in the HOA's claims. The black neighbor answered each question with calm, precise explanations, demonstrating both his knowledge and composure. He did not exaggerate, he did not embellish, and he did not act out of anger. His presentation was professional, thorough, and convincing. As the investigation proceeded, word of unusual federal attention began to spread quietly in the neighborhood. Some residents noticed agents moving discreetly, while others saw board members looking unusually tense and worried. Slowly, whispers began circulating. People who had previously been unsure about the HOA's methods started to question whether the board's behavior had really been appropriate. The black neighbor continued his normal life, but the dynamics around him were shifting rapidly. Where once there had been tension directed at him, there was now a growing sense of unease among the board members. They were no longer the ones in control. Instead, their every action was being scrutinized. Each meeting they held, each decision they made, had the potential to be part of the investigation. During one particularly revealing moment, the federal agents returned with questions for the board members. They requested to speak with individuals who had been directly involved in sending the fake officers. The board, unprepared for this level of scrutiny, scrambled to compose themselves. Some members tried to deny involvement, while others stumbled over inconsistencies in their statements. The investigators calmly documented each interaction, noting every discrepancy and every admission. The black neighbor observed the proceedings quietly. He did not intervene, did not boast, and did not seek attention. His focus was on clarity and fairness. He wanted the HOA's actions exposed, but he did not want to humiliate anyone unnecessarily. His goal was accountability, ensuring that the harassment would not continue and that the neighborhood could return to a sense of respect and safety. As the investigation unfolded, neighbors began to speak up. Those who had witnessed unusual activity, suspicious vehicles, or threatening letters provided statements. Some had previously been hesitant, fearing backlash from the board, but the presence of federal authorities gave them confidence. Slowly, the narrative of intimidation and harassment became clear. The HOA board could no longer hide behind rules or authority. Their actions were documented and undeniable. The president of the HOA grew increasingly anxious. She had assumed that persistence and intimidation would eventually bend the black neighbor to her will, but she had underestimated his patience and intelligence. Now, with federal investigators reviewing the evidence and neighbors coming forward, her confidence was shaken. She attempted to deflect, claiming that everything had been done in the neighborhood's interest, but the facts spoke louder than her words. Meanwhile, the black neighbor continued to handle the situation with calm dignity. He maintained polite interactions with neighbors, keeping a low profile while the investigation took its course. He did not need to confront the board directly. The evidence, the statements, and the presence of authorities were enough to make his case clear. Each day, the HOA's influence over the neighborhood weakened. Their control, which they had taken for granted, was slipping away. In a quiet conversation with a neighbor, he explained the importance of documentation, patience, and calm action. He emphasized that intimidation could be countered without confrontation, and that careful observation could protect both individuals and communities. The neighbor listened, impressed by his composure and clarity. It was clear that his approach had not only exposed wrongdoing, but had also inspired others to stand up against harassment in their own way. One morning, federal investigators visited the HOA president at her home. They presented evidence of the fake officers, the letters, and the surveillance attempts. She initially tried to minimize the events, claiming that the actions were minor and justified. But as the agents explained the legal implications, her demeanor shifted. She realized that the situation was far more serious than she had imagined. Impersonating law enforcement and orchestrating harassment were federal offenses, and there was no room for denial. The other board members faced similar inquiries. Some admitted involvement, some tried to deflect, but none could deny the overwhelming evidence. Each recorded conversation, each documented letter, and each neighbor's statement contributed to a clear and undeniable picture. The HOA's attempts to maintain authority had backfired completely. Meanwhile, the neighborhood began to change. Residents who had previously stayed silent started discussing the events openly. Conversations shifted from petty complaints to the seriousness of harassment, accountability, and fairness. People began to question authority in a more thoughtful way, recognizing that rules should not be enforced through intimidation. The black neighbor's calm, strategic approach had not only protected him, but had also encouraged a broader sense of justice in the community. During this period, the black neighbor remained remarkably composed. He continued his routines, tending to the garden, walking the dog, and interacting politely with neighbors. He avoided confrontation, focusing instead on clarity and fairness. He knew that allowing emotions to take over could undermine the careful record he had built, and he refused to give the board any opportunity to claim provocation. By now, the HOA president and her allies were beginning to face real consequences. The presence of federal investigators and the growing neighborhood awareness had eroded their influence. The fear they had hoped to instill in the black neighbor had turned against them, as their own actions were fully documented and exposed. Their authority, which they had wielded for years, was being questioned by everyone who had once deferred to them. One day, a meeting was held at the neighborhood clubhouse, attended by residents, board members, and federal investigators. The investigators explained the findings, detailing the harassment, the impersonation of law enforcement, and the violations of federal law. The residents listened in shock, realizing the extent of the HOA's misconduct. The black neighbor, sitting quietly among them, observed the reactions with calm satisfaction. He did not speak unnecessarily. The facts themselves spoke louder than any words he could offer. As the meeting progressed, it became clear that several board members would face legal consequences. Some were asked to step down immediately, others were warned of potential charges, and all were instructed to cease any further harassment. The power dynamics in the neighborhood had shifted completely. Where once the board had controlled the narrative, they were now under scrutiny and accountability. The black neighbor's approach had proven effective. By remaining calm, documenting every action, and involving the proper authorities, he had turned an intimidation attempt into a clear case of harassment. He had protected himself, inspired neighbors, and ensured that the HOA could no longer act with impunity. The neighborhood, once dominated by fear and control, was beginning to experience a sense of fairness and respect. Neighbors approached him quietly after the meeting, expressing gratitude and admiration. They were impressed by his patience, intelligence, and composure. Some admitted that they had been intimidated by the board themselves, but seeing how he handled the situation gave them courage. The black neighbor remained modest, emphasizing that careful observation, documentation, and calm action were key to protecting oneself and the community. Over the following weeks, changes in the neighborhood became evident. The HOA board, now under legal scrutiny, could no longer enforce